I didn't mean to spill the coffee. You're fired!
She's my daughter! And today, you'll regret what you did to her.
4 days before her own wedding, Aaliyah Monroe was on her knees in a house that wasn't hers, scrubbing a marble staircase raw with a brush too small for the job, and not one person under that roof knew who she really was. Rain came down hard against the tall windows behind her, the kind of steady Georgia rain that doesn't ask permission, and somewhere down the long hallway a grandfather clock ticked through the silence like it was counting something down. Her hands were cracked at the knuckles. Her back ached in a way it had never ached before in 27 years of a life that had never once required her to kneel for anyone. And yet there she was, in a gray uniform 2 sizes too big, hair pulled back so tight it pulled at her scalp, working a stain out of stone that had been laid by men her own family's construction company had once employed. Nobody in that house knew that the woman on her knees owned 3 of the very buildings the Whitfield fortune had been built to rival. Nobody knew her name was Aaliyah Monroe. And by the time this night was finished, every single person under that roof would know exactly who she was, and exactly why she'd come. Before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. To understand how a Monroe ended up scrubbing floors in the house of the family she was about to marry into, you have to go back 3 weeks to a glass office on the 40th floor of a building in downtown Atlanta with her father's name on the lease and her mother's photograph on the desk. Marcus Monroe had built Monroe Holdings up from a single strip of undeveloped land into one of the largest black-owned real estate and technology portfolios in the Southeast, and he had done it, mostly, alone, ever since his wife Diane passed 5 years earlier. He kept her photograph angled just slightly away from his own chair, close enough to see, far enough that he didn't have to look at it while he worked. That morning, he'd called his daughter into his office not to ask her opinion, but to inform her of a decision that had already been made on her behalf. The Whitfield family, one of the oldest and most respected names in Atlanta business circles, needed capital. Monroe Holdings needed the credibility of an old money name to open doors that new money still, even now, struggled to open. And somewhere in the negotiations between 2 grown men who trusted spreadsheets more than they trusted each other, it had been decided that Aaliyah would marry Julian Whitfield, and that this would be called love. Aaliyah didn't argue with her father that morning. She rarely did anymore. She had learned a long time ago that Marcus Monroe negotiated with everyone in his life the same way, including his own daughter, and that the fastest way through a conversation with him was to let him believe he'd won it. But that night, at a restaurant with white tablecloths and a wine list longer than the menu, sitting across from the man she was supposed to spend the rest of her life with, she watched Julian Whitfield check his phone twice within the first 10 minutes, both times after a message came in with his mother's name on the screen. He was polite. He complimented her dress. He asked about her father's health in the careful, distant way people ask questions they already know the answer to. And underneath all of it, Aaliyah felt something she couldn't quite name yet, a kind of quiet, gnawing certainty that she was about to spend her whole life being loved for a last name instead of a person, the same way she'd been loved, or not loved, by nearly everyone who'd ever wanted something from her family. She didn't sleep that night. She sat by her apartment window with the city lights spread out below her, the kind of view most people spend a lifetime working toward, and she called the one person who'd known her since before any of this money meant anything, her assistant and oldest friend, Renee Baptiste. She told Renee what she wanted to do. She wanted to disappear for a few weeks. She wanted to walk into Whitfield Manor under a different name, in a uniform instead of a designer dress, and find out for herself whether anyone in that family, including the man she was engaged to, would have looked at her twice if she hadn't come with a fortune attached. Renee argued with her for almost an hour. She said it was reckless. She said if Marcus Monroe found out his daughter was scrubbing floors for the family he was about to merge his empire with, he'd have a heart attack, and given his history, she meant that literally, not as a figure of speech. Aaliyah's answer to all of it was simple, and it was the only answer she gave the whole night. She said she would rather know the truth ugly than marry a lie beautiful, and no amount of arguing was going to change her mind. 3 days later, a woman named Grace Bennett arrived at the gates of Whitfield Manor with a single suitcase and a folder of forged references that Renee had spent 2 sleepless nights making airtight. The manor sat at the end of a long gravel drive, behind hedges cut with the kind of precision that told you someone was paid handsomely to make sure nothing there ever looked out of place. It was beautiful in the way old wealth insists on being beautiful, and there was something almost staged about it. A house arranged for people to look at rather than a house anyone actually lived in. At the servants' entrance around the side, a heavy-set woman in her 50s with tired, watchful eyes looked Grace up and down without saying a word of welcome. Her name was Denise Coleman, and she had been the head housekeeper at Whitfield Manor for 18 years, long enough to have trained a dozen young women who hadn't lasted a month in that house, and long enough to have learned exactly how much to say and how much to keep buried. She handed Grace her uniform, told her where she'd be sleeping, and warned her, almost as an afterthought, that Mrs. Whitfield did not like the Monroe name spoken anywhere inside that house. She didn't explain why. Grace didn't ask, but she filed it away, the same way she filed away the sharp, appraising look a younger maid named Tasha Greer gave her from across the kitchen. The look of someone sizing up new competition before a single word had even been exchanged. It was in the garden that afternoon, raking wet leaves into soaked black piles under a sky that hadn't stopped threatening rain since morning, that she first saw him. A man near her own age, sleeves pushed up past his forearms despite the cold, moving through the yard with the kind of ease that told you he'd rather be anywhere doing anything than making small talk with the new girl. His name was Malik Reeves, and he worked the grounds and drove the family car when Robert Whitfield needed driving. And he looked at Grace Bennett for 1 second too long when Denise introduced her. The kind of look that wasn't attraction exactly, not yet, but recognition, like a man clocking that something about this new maid didn't add up, though for reasons he had no intention yet of naming out loud. He asked her, almost too casually, where she was really from. Not where she'd worked last, where she was from. And Aaliyah Monroe, standing in a stranger's garden in a stranger's uniform 4 days before she was supposed to become a Whitfield, understood in that moment that she wasn't the only person in that house who had walked through its gates carrying a name that wasn't entirely true. That first night, lying in a narrow bed in the staff quarters with rain still tapping against a smaller, plainer window than the one she was used to, Aaliyah thought about her mother. She thought about the framed photograph on her father's desk, angled just far enough away that he never had to face it directly. She thought about a wedding 4 days out that suddenly felt less like the end of a courtship and more like the opening move of something much larger, something none of them, not her father, not Julian, maybe not even Catherine Whitfield herself, fully understood yet. She had come into this house looking for one truth. She had no way of knowing yet that she was about to find 3. The days that followed settled into a rhythm Aaliyah had never lived inside of before. The strange, quiet vertigo of being present in a room and completely unseen in it. She had spent 27 years being looked at, assessed, greeted, courted, and now she moved through Whitfield Manor carrying trays and folding linens while grown adults spoke over her head as though she were a fixture of the house rather than a person standing 3 feet away. She learned quickly that Catherine Whitfield's cruelty rarely arrived loud. It arrived in the correction of a fork set a half-inch out of place, in the way she addressed Denise Coleman after 18 years of service, as though she were speaking to a chair that had briefly grown legs. In the particular silence she left hanging in a room until a servant understood, without being told twice, that they had failed at something they hadn't even known was being tested. Aaliyah had grown up around wealth her entire life, but she had never before been on the receiving end of what wealth could do to a person's manners, when it had nothing left to prove and everything left to protect. It was on the fourth day that she found herself alone with Julian in the east sitting room, and the conversation that followed told her more about the man she was engaged to than 4 months of dinners with white tablecloths ever had. He didn't recognize her, of course. Why would he? In his mind, he had never met this woman before in his life, and something about that anonymity seemed to loosen something in him that Aaliyah had never once seen loosen in her own presence. He talked about his father's declining health with real worry in his voice. He talked about a marriage being arranged for him with a bitterness so plain it startled her, a bitterness aimed not at the woman he was marrying, but at a life that had been assembled around him, piece by piece, without ever once asking what he actually wanted it to look like. He said, almost to himself, that he wished his mother had let him choose someone on his own, just once, about anything. Aaliyah stood there in her gray uniform, holding a tray she no longer remembered picking up, listening to her own fiancé grieve a version of his life that included her only as a decision made above both their heads. She told herself that was the worst of it. She was wrong. 2 days later, carrying a stack of pressed linens past Robert Whitfield's study, she heard Julian's voice through the half-open door, low and unguarded in the way people only speak when they believe themselves entirely alone. He was on the phone with a friend from college, someone he clearly trusted enough to be honest with, and the honesty was the part that cut. He said he was handling the marriage the way you handle a merger you never asked to be part of. He said his mother had picked the arrangement the same way she'd have picked a supplier, the way she picked everything, on paper, on numbers, on what the Monroe name could open up for the family that the Whitfield name alone no longer could. He said, and this was the part Aaliyah would carry with her longer than anything else in that house, that he sometimes wished his mother had let him choose someone he actually wanted instead of someone who came already approved. He didn't say it with malice. He didn't even say it about her specifically, not by name, not with any real cruelty behind it. It didn't matter. Aaliyah stood in that hallway in a stranger's uniform, holding linens meant for a bed she was supposed to sleep in as a wife within the week, and heard the man she was set to marry describe her, without knowing it was her, as a line item on a balance sheet. She didn't cry. She had learned a long time ago, growing up the only child of a man who negotiated grief the same way he negotiated everything else, that crying rarely solved anything and almost always got noticed at the wrong moment. She finished her round of the linens. She served dinner that evening with her expression arranged into the same practiced neutrality every other maid in that house wore like a second uniform. And it was only well past midnight, when the house had gone fully dark and the rain had finally eased into something softer, that she found herself in the garden again, sitting on a stone bench she hadn't planned on sitting on, in a coat that wasn't warm enough for the hour. Malik found her there. He didn't ask what was wrong. He didn't perform concern the way people who want something from you tend to perform it. He simply sat down beside her, close enough that she could feel the warmth off his arm without either of them acknowledging it. And after a while he got up without a word and came back with 2 cups of tea he'd made in the staff kitchen, handing one to her without asking whether she wanted it. The way you hand something to someone you've already decided you're going to look after whether they've asked you to or not. They didn't talk about the manner. They didn't talk about Julian or Catherine or the wedding 4 days out that Aaliyah still hadn't found a way to think clearly about. They just sat there in the cold, quiet dark, 2 people carrying names that weren't entirely their own, and for the first time since she'd walked through those gates, Aaliyah felt something in her chest loosen instead of tighten. She didn't know yet that Robert Whitfield had taken a call that same evening about what he called the transfer documents, and had told the person on the other end of the line, in a voice pitched low enough that only the housekeeper folding towels in the next room happened to catch it, that nothing would move until the ring was on her finger. She didn't know that Tasha Greer had noticed her lingering near that study more than any new maid reasonably should, and had already begun turning that fact over in her mind, deciding what it might be worth to somebody. All she knew sitting in that garden with a cup of tea going cold in her hands, was that the house she'd walked into to test one man's love had already started showing her something far larger and far older than a young man's cold feet about an arranged marriage, and that whatever it was, it had roots that went back further than she or Julian had ever been told. The call came in on the 5th morning, while Aaliyah was 3 floors above in a bedroom that wasn't hers, changing sheets on a mattress meant for a family she still hadn't fully understood. It was Renee's number that lit up the burner phone tucked inside the lining of her uniform pocket, and something in the second ring alone told her this wasn't a check-in call. Her father had collapsed at the office. Not a heart attack, the doctors would clarify later, though clarify was a generous word for how little comfort it actually offered, but what they called a warning episode, the kind of thing a man's body does when it's been carrying more than it was built to carry for far longer than anyone around him realized. Aaliyah didn't remember making the decision to leave the house. She remembered gravel under her shoes, and the back seat of a cab, and her own hands shaking as she peeled off an apron she'd forgotten she was still wearing, half a mile from the hospital, because some instinct in her refused to let her father see his daughter dressed as someone else's maid while he lay in a bed hooked up to machines that beeped in a rhythm too, even to be reassuring. Marcus Monroe, propped up against thin hospital pillows with color that hadn't fully returned to his face, tried to talk business within the first 2 minutes of seeing her. He asked about the merger timeline before he asked how she was doing. It was such a familiar failure of a father that Aaliyah, standing over him in a hospital gown's worth of fluorescent light, felt something crack open in her chest that had nothing to do with his heart and everything to do with her own. She didn't tell him where she'd been. She didn't tell him about Julian's phone call, or the study door left half open, or the strange, unplaced tenderness that had settled over her in a garden 2 nights earlier. She just held his hand until his color came back fully, and she understood, sitting there, that whatever time she had left to find the truth before this wedding happened had just been cut sharply shorter than she'd planned for. Back at the manor the next afternoon, she found out just how much shorter. Tasha Greer, watching her own footing in that house grow more uncertain every week, Denise seemed to favor the new girl, had mentioned to Catherine, with the careful innocence of someone planting a seed she fully intended to watch grow, that Grace had been seen lingering near Mr. Whitfield's study more than once, and always when nobody else was around. Catherine didn't raise her voice when she called Grace into the drawing room that evening. She never needed to. She asked her questions the way a woman asks questions when she already suspects the answer and is only listening for the shape of the lie that comes back to her. Where had Grace worked before this house? Why had she left? What exactly had she been doing near her husband's study on 3 separate occasions that a member of staff had happened to notice? Aaliyah answered every question with the same practiced calm she'd used her whole life in board meetings where powerful men tried to catch her out, and she walked out of that room with her cover barely intact, and Catherine's eyes following her the entire way to the door, the particular attention of a woman who has decided to watch someone rather than trust them. It was 2 days after that when the car pulled up the gravel drive that didn't belong to any guest on the household's calendar, plain and unmarked in a way that felt deliberate, and the 2 men who stepped out of it were shown into Robert Whitfield's study with an urgency the staff weren't meant to notice, but couldn't help noticing anyway. Voices rose behind that closed door in a way voices in that house never rose. Denise, gathering up the coffee service afterward with her mouth set in a hard, tired line, said nothing to Grace directly, not at first. It was only later, in the kitchen, drying cups that didn't need drying, that she finally spoke, quietly, almost to herself. She said this house hadn't been what it looked like for a good while now, longer than most people would guess from the outside, and that she'd learned a long time ago that the prettier a house kept its hedges, the more it usually had buried under the flower beds. It wasn't a confession. It wasn't even really an explanation. But it was the first time in 18 years, Aaliyah would learn much later, that Denise Coleman had said that much out loud to anyone under that roof. And it marked the moment the older woman stopped watching the new maid as a threat and started watching her, instead, as someone who might finally be worth trusting. That evening, Malik found her in the garden shed, sorting through tools that didn't need sorting, in the particular way people busy their hands when their minds won't sit still. He didn't ease into it the way he usually did. He told her plainly that he'd been watching this family for reasons of his own, reasons that went back further than his time working these grounds, and that he suspected, whatever her real story was, it wasn't so different from his in shape, even if the details didn't match. He didn't ask her to explain herself. He didn't offer his own explanation either. They stood there in the half-dark of that shed, two people who had each walked into Whitfield Manor wearing a name that wasn't fully their own, circling the edges of a trust neither of them was ready to hand over completely, and behind them, half hidden on a shelf near Robert's study window that neither of them had noticed yet, a photograph sat framed and dust-covered, showing a much younger Robert Whitfield standing beside a man whose face, had either of them looked closely enough that night, would have changed everything they thought they understood about how they'd both ended up in this house at exactly the same time. Marcus came home from the hospital 3 days later thinner in the face than Aaliyah remembered him ever looking, and scared in a way he would never once put into words, though it showed in every small decision he made that week. He told her, over a dinner neither of them finished, that he wanted the wedding moved up. Not delayed, not reconsidered, moved up, sooner, while he still had the strength to walk his only daughter down an aisle he'd already decided mattered more than almost anything else he had left to give her. He said it gently, the way he said most things when he was afraid of losing control of them, but underneath the gentleness Aaliyah heard the truth of it clearly enough. Her father wasn't asking. He was running out of time, in his own mind if not in fact, and he wanted the one thing he still believed he could guarantee her, security wrapped in an old name, locked into place before his own body could take that choice away from him too. Aaliyah sat across from him, in a home that was hers, in a life that was supposed to be simpler than the one she'd been secretly living inside a stranger's uniform, and understood that whatever time she had left to uncover the truth at Whitfield Manor had just been cut down to almost nothing. She went back the next morning anyway. It was Julian who found her first, in the same east sitting room where she'd first heard him speak so plainly about a life he hadn't chosen. His mother was out of the house for the afternoon, some errand involving caterers and flower arrangements for a wedding that was now, unbeknownst to him, arriving faster than even he'd been told. Without Catherine's presence pressing down on every room she occupied, Julian seemed to unfold a little, the way a person does when a weight they've carried so long they've stopped noticing it finally lifts for an hour. He told Grace, without much prompting, that he didn't think his fiancée actually liked him. He said it plainly, without self-pity, the way a man says something he's turned over in his mind so many times it stopped hurting quite the way it used to. He said he didn't blame her for it, not really, because he wasn't sure he'd have liked himself either, arriving into her life fully assembled by other people's decisions, offering nothing of himself that felt entirely his own. Aaliyah sat there, in her own fiancé's family home, in a uniform he didn't recognize, and listened to him grieve a relationship she was actually living inside of, and found she didn't know which was harder to bear, his honesty or her own silence in the face of it. It was Malik who found her afterward, later that same evening, in the cold hush of the garden that had become, without either of them quite naming it, the one place in that entire house where she felt like herself. He didn't ease into what he wanted to say this time either. He told her plainly that he'd caught feelings for her he hadn't planned on catching, feelings that had crept up on him somewhere between her first week and now without his permission, and that he needed to know, honestly, whether there was any version of this where she wasn't simply going to vanish the moment whatever life she'd left behind finally called her back to it. He said he'd spent enough of his life guessing at people's real intentions to know better than to fall for someone without asking first. Aaliyah stood there in the cold with her own engagement 4 days closer than it had been a week ago, unable to answer him honestly without unraveling every layer of the lie she was still living inside of. And for the first time since she'd walked through the gates of Whitfield Manor, she understood that the choice in front of her was no longer simply about what she'd find in that house. It was about who she'd become by the time she found it. She made her decision that same night, alone in the narrow staff bed, staring up at a ceiling that wasn't hers. She would stay 1 more week, no matter what it cost her, no matter how much closer her father pushed the wedding date, because a suspicion wasn't proof, and she hadn't come this far to walk away with nothing but a bad feeling and a broken engagement to show for it. 2 nights later, with the house fully asleep and the rain outside finally quiet for the first time in days, she slipped down the back stairs toward Robert Whitfield's study, heart going harder in her chest than it had any right to for a woman simply walking through a house she technically worked in. She'd almost made it to the door when she heard footsteps behind her in the dark hallway, close enough that her breath caught before she even turned around, certain for one long, terrible second that Tasha had finally decided to make good on her suspicions. It wasn't Tasha. It was Denise, standing there in her night clothes with a small brass key held out in her open palm, and an expression on her face that told Aaliyah she'd been waiting for this exact moment far longer than either of them had known each other. She said she'd been waiting 18 years for somebody in that house to finally look, and that whatever Grace found behind that locked drawer, she wanted her to know she wasn't the first person under that roof who'd suspected something was buried there. She just hadn't ever had the nerve, or the standing, to go looking herself. The drawer gave way easier than she expected, the small brass key turning with a soft click that felt far too quiet for what came out of it. Inside, beneath a stack of household receipts meant to disguise exactly this kind of thing from anyone who wasn't looking hard enough, sat a folder of legal documents thick enough that Aaliyah had to steady her hands just to hold it properly. Denise stood watch by the door while she read, and what Aaliyah found in that folder, by the dim light of a small desk lamp, she didn't dare turn any brighter, rearranged everything she thought she understood about the wedding she was 4 days out from walking into. Buried inside pages of language dense enough to have been written specifically to discourage anyone from reading them closely was a single clause, tucked into the merger agreement between Monroe Holdings and the Whitfield Family Trust, that transferred voting control of her father's company automatically upon the completion of the marriage. Not shared control, not a partnership built on the appearance of equal footing that both fathers had described to their children. Full transfer triggered the moment a wedding ring went on Aaliyah's finger, drafted by lawyers her father's own legal team had never been shown, buried inside an agreement Marcus Monroe believed he'd negotiated as an equal. The wedding wasn't a merger of 2 families. It was a hostile takeover dressed up in flowers and toasts and a mother of the bride dress Aaliyah hadn't even picked out yet. She sat with that discovery for only a moment before she found the second folder. Older, the paper yellowed in a way that told her it had been sitting in that drawer for a very long time. Correspondence, more than 20 years old, between Catherine Whitfield and a lawyer whose name Aaliyah didn't recognize, detailing, in cold, careful language, how a business deal and a reputation belonging to a young woman named Diane had been quietly and deliberately destroyed. Aaliyah's hands went still on the page. Diane, her mother's name, appearing in letters written before Aaliyah had even been born, describing a woman who, it became clear line by line, had once been the person Marcus Monroe almost married before he married anyone else. Catherine had lost him first, and rather than let that loss stay in the past where it belonged, she had spent more than 2 decades making certain that everything Diane once had, and everything Diane's daughter stood to inherit, would eventually end up in Whitfield hands instead. The cold correction of a fork. The silence in every room she entered. None of it had ever been about class or manners or the small performance of old money looking down on new. It had been personal from the very beginning, and Aaliyah had been the last piece Catherine needed to finally finish what she'd started before Aaliyah had ever drawn breath. She was still sitting with that when Malik found her, having noticed the light under the study door and known immediately something was wrong. She didn't have the strength left that night to keep her own secret from him any longer, not after what she'd just read. And so she told him everything, her real name, why she'd come, what she'd just found in her hands. He didn't look shocked in the way she expected. He looked instead like a man finally hearing the last piece of a puzzle he'd been quietly assembling for years land into place. His real name, he told her, wasn't Reeves by accident of birth alone. It was the name of his father, Thomas Reeves, a man who had once been Marcus Monroe's original business partner, before a deal engineered by Robert Whitfield 15 years earlier had ruined him financially and left his name so thoroughly disgraced that he'd never fully recovered, dying still trying to clear it. Malik had come to Whitfield Manor under his mother's maiden name for the same reason Aaliyah had walked through its gates as Grace Bennett. He'd come looking for proof of what had been done to his father, without ever once suspecting the woman doing the same digging beside him was the daughter of the very man his father had once trusted most. Two people, each carrying a name that wasn't fully their own, had walked into that house from opposite directions to solve what turned out to be two halves of the exact same betrayal, and neither of them had known it until the night the truth finally ran out of room to stay hidden. The last confrontation happened the following evening, and it happened with Julian, not with his parents. Aaliyah told him everything, standing in the same east sitting room where he'd once confessed to her, without knowing who she was, that he didn't think his fiancée really liked him. She watched his face while she spoke, watched him move through disbelief, and then through something that looked almost like relief, the particular relief of a man finally understanding that the coldness he'd always sensed in his own home had never been imagined. He didn't defend his parents. He didn't ask her to keep quiet to protect the family name. He sat there in silence for a long moment, and then he told her, quietly, that he wanted to help her finish this, not because he owed her anything as her fiancée, but because for the first time in his adult life, somebody had finally told him the truth about his own family instead of managing him around it. The engagement gala arrived exactly on schedule, 3 days moved up from its original date at Marcus's insistence, and Whitfield Manor had been transformed for the occasion into something almost unrecognizable from the house Aaliyah had spent the last 3 weeks scrubbing floors inside of. Chandeliers blazed over a ballroom full of Atlanta's oldest names and newest money, press photographers stationed discreetly near the entrance, waitstaff moving through the crowd with trays of champagne that Aaliyah herself had helped polish glasses for only 2 nights earlier. Catherine Whitfield stood near the center of the room in a dress the color of old money, glowing with the particular satisfaction of a woman about to watch more than 20 years of patience finally pay out in full. Marcus Monroe stood near her, freshly recovered enough to insist on attending despite his doctor's warnings, entirely unaware that the night he believed was sealing his daughter's future was actually the final move in a plan built to take everything from her. Aaliyah didn't arrive as Grace, and she didn't arrive in the wedding dress that had been fitted for her that week. She walked into that ballroom in her own name, in her own clothes, with Malik on one side of her and Denise Coleman on the other, and a folder of documents held plainly in her hand for anyone in that room to see. The music didn't stop right away. It took a moment for the room to understand what it was looking at, the new maid from Whitfield Manor standing in the middle of the gala being announced, in a voice that carried further than she'd intended, as Aaliyah Monroe. She didn't wait for anyone to invite her to speak. She read the marriage clause aloud, word for word, the language that transferred voting control of Monroe Holdings automatically upon her wedding to Julian, in front of lawyers, reporters, and a room full of people who had come expecting champagne and toasts rather than a reckoning. She named what Catherine had done to her mother more than 2 decades earlier, plainly, without theatrics, letting the facts do the work that anger might otherwise have undercut. She watched Catherine's composure, built and maintained so carefully for so many years, finally crack in front of the exact social circle she'd spent her whole life curating. Robert, cornered by his own creditors standing uncomfortably near the back of the room, admitted more in the next 5 minutes than he had admitted to his own family in 15 years, choosing, in the end, to confess rather than stand there and watch his wife take the full weight of it alone. Marcus Monroe heard the truth about Diane for the first time standing in that ballroom, in front of strangers, rather than from his daughter in the privacy either of them would have preferred. Aaliyah watched something move across her father's face that she had never once seen there before, not at Diane's funeral, not in any of the quiet years since. A grief finally given permission to surface after 22 years of being managed instead of felt. He reached for his daughter's hand in front of that entire room, and when he spoke, his voice carried none of the boardroom precision she'd grown up hearing from him. He told her he was sorry, not for the merger, not for the wedding he'd pushed forward out of fear, but for every year he'd spent asking what the company needed instead of asking what she needed, and for never once telling her, plainly, who her mother had really been before she became a photograph angled just out of his direct line of sight. Julian ended the engagement himself, standing in front of the same room that had gathered to celebrate it, and it was the one decision in the entire night that belonged fully to him rather than to his parents. He confirmed what Aaliyah had said, told the room what he'd overheard and understood in the weeks since, and for the first time in his adult life, made a choice about his own family's future without waiting to be told what that choice should be. The consequences that followed moved quickly once the truth was out in a room too large and too public to be quietly managed back into silence. Robert faced fraud charges within the month, the merger clause unraveling under legal scrutiny that Marcus's own lawyers finally had proper cause to demand. The Whitfield estate itself, propped up for years over debts the family had hidden even from their own son, was seized not long after. The hedges that had once been cut with such precision left finally, publicly, to grow wild. Catherine's name, spoken for decades in rooms full of people who valued her opinion above almost anyone else's in the city, stopped being spoken in most of those same rooms within a matter of weeks. The particular, quiet collapse of a reputation built entirely on other people never learning what she'd actually done to earn it. Months passed before the house on Habersham Road felt like it belonged to both of them again, instead of just to one grieving man rattling around inside it. Marcus Monroe had color back in his face that Aaliyah hadn't seen since before her mother passed. The specific kind of color that comes from a man finally putting down a weight he'd been carrying so long he'd mistaken it for part of his own body. The company had steadied. The lawyers had done what lawyers do once the truth is out in the open, and there's nothing left to protect by hiding it. But it was the smaller changes that told Aaliyah something real had shifted between them. The way her father had started asking her opinion on decisions before he made them instead of after. The way he'd stopped calling her into his office to be informed and started calling her in to be consulted, like a partner instead of an asset he was managing on behalf of a company that had never once asked to be the center of her life. One Sunday that fall, he asked her to come with him to the cemetery, something he hadn't done in the 5 years since Diane had been buried there, always finding some reason to go alone instead. They stood together in front of a headstone worn just slightly by weather. Marcus quiet for a long while before he finally spoke, and when he did, his voice carried none of the careful distance Aaliyah had grown used to hearing whenever her mother's name came up in his presence. He told Diane, plainly, that he was sorry, not simply for what Catherine had done to her all those years ago, but for the 22 years afterward he'd spent letting that old wound decide how much of the full story he ever let their daughter know. He said it had taken losing control of his own company, and very nearly losing his own health, to understand that protecting Aaliyah from the truth about her mother had never actually protected her from anything at all. It had only made her spend years wondering why her father could never quite look directly at a photograph of the woman he claimed to love more than anyone. Aaliyah didn't say much standing there beside him. She didn't need to. Some conversations only need one person to finally say the thing out loud, and the other person's job is simply to stand close enough to hear it land. That evening, she found Malik in the same garden where all of it had started, though it looked nothing like the garden she remembered from her first week at Whitfield Manor. The estate had new owners now, and Malik no longer worked its grounds, but they'd kept coming back to that particular patch of it anyway, an old stone bench near a hedge that had finally, after years of forced precision, been allowed to grow however it wanted to. There were no uniforms between them anymore, no false names, nothing left in either of their pockets that the other didn't already fully know about. He handed her tea again, the same unhurried way he had that very first cold night, and this time neither of them needed to sit there in careful silence pretending not to notice the warmth passing between them. She thought, sitting there with the last of the season's light going gold and low across the grass, about everything that 4 weeks in a stranger's uniform had actually taught her. Not that money couldn't buy love, though it couldn't, and not that the truth always comes out eventually, though it usually does if you're patient and stubborn enough to go looking for it properly. What she'd learned, sitting on her knees on a marble staircase that didn't belong to her, was something simpler and harder to say out loud without sounding like a lesson from a greeting card. The people worth keeping in your life are the ones who would have stayed exactly the same even if you'd never once had a dime to your name. The ones who look at you the same way whether you're wearing silk or a gray uniform 2 sizes too big, on your knees scrubbing someone else's floor. The truest test of her marriage was never going to be the wedding day itself, the flowers, the toasts, the dress she'd never ended up wearing. It had been 4 weeks nobody else knew about, when nothing she owned meant anything to the 2 people who mattered most, and both of them had chosen her anyway. She stood up from that bench as the last of the daylight gave way, in her own name, in her own clothes, in a life finally built entirely on the truth instead of around it.